President Joe Biden is meeting King Charles at Windsor Castle today as part of his trip to the UK. The visit was announced earlier this month by the White House, who said it would further strengthen the close relationship between our nations. Very familiar language for those who watch the so-called special relationship between the US and the UK. Let's find out a little bit more and reflect on some of the previous presidential visits with presidential historian Dr. Laura Smith. Before we talk about previous presidential visits over to the UK, Laura, talk to me a little bit about this one, because I suppose one of the things that they're going to be talking about, Joe Biden and King Charles, is climate change, talk about the various climate discussions, and that's familiar ground for both of them, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. I think it's really interesting that we have two leaders here who very much share the same interests, obviously kind of a similar generation, but very much share a similar interests and goals in terms of looking forward and prioritizing things such as climate change for the next generation. And it's something that is not always the case. You have U.S. presidential leaders, some of whom, if they're for the Republican Party, are more conservative and not always in keeping more with British priorities and priorities over here that are shared by prime ministers and sometimes monarchs as well, such as climate change, which is obviously very specific to King Charles. Of course, President Biden, he didn't come over for the coronation. Jill Biden, the First Lady, came instead. That was probably seen as the most appropriate thing to do, considering it was just a month away from Independence Day. So it could have been a bit awkward for an American president to actually come to the coronation. But of course, it would be his first time meeting Charles after the coronation.
So talk to me about some of the other kind of significant visits that we've seen previously. I suppose the most recent one would have been the then President Donald Trump.
Yes, absolutely, in 2019. And it really has become more common for presidents to get a state visit, a proper state visit in the UK, where they're welcomed at Windsor Castle, where they meet the monarch. And of course, this is very traditional. It's apt and steeped in tradition. And that's certainly not in keeping with President Donald Trump. And so his reaction and the way in which that he managed that, and the sort of lack of familiarity and maybe a bit of awkwardness as well, considering how he seemed to herald in more of a populist approach that was not, even though there are parallels made between him and Boris Johnson, was certainly not as in keeping with the British system. So I think it was a little more awkward, and obviously there's a very famous picture of him walking in front of the Queen, we presume accidentally, but certainly, again, it would just reflect this idea that he was definitely not traditional in any way, sense, or form, even back home in the US. So I think, this is very different in that direct comparison. When Biden pitched himself to the American voters as getting back to some sort of normality, I think this is another example of that when it comes to the special relationship as well.
And Trump's visit, I suppose, was at complete odds with that of Ronald Reagan many years ago, and his trip over to the UK to visit the late Queen, where I think he rode on horseback and Windsor Great Park alongside her.
Absolutely. And if you visit the Reagan Library in California, it's something that is really emphasized, his contribution as such to special relationship. His relationship not only with the Queen, but especially with Maggie Thatcher as well. There's a huge photograph at the end of him and all of these pictures, including the state visit in 1982. And I think this is another really interesting contrast in terms of the timing of this visit. Because, of course, Trump's visit that we just spoke about happened on his way to NATO. And we all remember some of the very controversial things he said to NATO, very much not in keeping with the concept of the special relationship and old European allies. Whereas Reagan, visiting at really a sort of high point, apex of the Cold War, was very much focused on ensuring that special relationship endured and even was strengthened. And that included, obviously, the relationship with NATO. So he was actually invited. Maggie Thatcher was determined that Reagan would give a parliament speech as well. And that was when he made his famous quote about the Soviet Union ending up on the ash heap of history. And just a year later, he would start the National Endowment for Democracy. Republicans still point to that speech as a pinnacle example of what was until Trump termed modern conservatism. But even now, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, more people, regardless of their partisanship, are pointing to that speech and saying that this is the idea of strengthening special relationship, ensuring that Britain and Europe and the US are all on the same page when it comes to finding peace.
So these kinds of visits are significant. What sort of coverage do they get in the US? Obviously, we're talking about it because it's happening here. Is it regarded as a big deal over the Atlantic?
I'm not sure American presidents would necessarily want it to be covered as a big deal in the same way as we do over here. And I think, especially post-Brexit, obviously it is very important for the UK to have that special relationship. But I think on the US side, foreign policy, unless there is a crisis, foreign policy is really not something that determines votes. It is not something that you hear much about unless, I don't know, you turn on cable at 2 a.m. It's really a focus on domestic policy all the time. It's quite insular. So I think, you do have the sort of royal watchers in the US, people who like the celebrity aspect, who follow that aspect of the UK. But apart from that, it's really not seen as such a big occasion as obviously the tradition and the history make it over here.
Laura, thank you for your time. That's presidential historian Dr. Laura Smith on BBC Radio Berkshire.